The United States government has been placing sanctions on Russia for years.
The United States is imposing new sanctions in key sectors of the Russian economy.
They have come as retaliation to everything from the annexation of Crimea to the crash of civilian airplane MH17 to Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. But what are these sanctions exactly, and does Russia really care? In 2014, President Barack Obama introduced sanctions over the annexation of Crimea.
The future of Ukraine must be decided by the people of Ukraine.
And again in December 2016, just weeks before he left office. The 2016 sanctions were introduced over Russian hacking and meddling in an attempt to influence the U.S. presidential election. Moscow denies any interference. In 2018, the U.S. joined the UK in sanctioning Russia over the Skripal poisonings.
The government has concluded that it is highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal.
The U.S. announced it was acting alongside its NATO allies, and over 100 Russian diplomats were expelled from Europe and North America. Multiple further sanctions were announced throughout 2018 over Russia's meddling in the U.S. election, but some sanctions against large Russian firms were lifted. It can be difficult to tell exactly how successful sanctions are because many different factors can come into play. How can we know exactly how much impact the sanctions against Russia have had?
Well, it's a complicated picture because sanctions are aimed at deterring in a way and are trying to curb someone's behavior. If you look at what Russia's been doing since the introduction of these sanctions, it hasn't really changed its behavior, has it? Because it's been consistently and in a tailored fashion interfering in Western democracies' elections and further in the United States. Clear links were established between the Trump campaign and Russian money, which means that Russia still hasn't changed its behavior in terms of interfering in US processes. The Skripal assassination attempt that took place in the UK did take place after the introduction of sanctions, way after the introduction of sanctions. So in a way, in terms of foreign policy behavior, Russia hasn't changed so much.
President Trump has repeatedly denied any collusion with Russia.
There was no collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian people.
But it has not stopped many from seeing him as closely tied to the Kremlin. Trump also frequently boasts about being tough on Russia.
Nobody's been tougher on Russia than I have.
Despite lifting recent sanctions that were aimed at targeting Russian businessmen, including Putin ally Oleg Deripaska. How does Trump's relationship with Putin affect the sanctions?
If it weren't for Trump, in a way, US sanctions would be probably very different, because the more Trump seems to be pro-Kremlin or pro-Russia or Russia-leaning, the more the rest of the US establishment needs to be anti-Russian and anti-Putin and anti-Kremlin. So in a way, it's a balancing game, depending on where the ticker is going, between Trump and the US establishment, which means that they need to over-exaggerate the effects that sanctions have in order to tame down the rhetoric that Trump has himself, say that sanctions are useless and should be lifted.
The impacts of these sanctions can be twisted and over-exaggerated to both justify them and increase perceived success.
They have to, in a way. If they want to justify the presence of sanctions, they need to justify the impact it has and the effects. So they need to amplify them.